It is the year 1528, in the hill town of Urbino, where the air is thin and cold and the stone of the ducal palace glows like pale bone in the moonlight. Inside the walls of this fortress, a group of men and women sit in a circle by the fire and play a game that will determine the social hierarchy of Europe for the next 500 years. They are discussing what it means to be perfect. The book that emerged from these nocturnal conversations is the Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione. It is a text that sits on the library shelves of nearly every great country house in England and every historic estate in Tuscany. It is not merely a manual on manners or a guide to etiquette. It is a treatise on the weaponization of charm and the strategic application of nonchalance. For those who inherit vast fortunes or manage the quiet levers of dynastic power, this book remains the primary instruction manual on how to exist above the fray while secretly controlling it. Castiglione was a diplomat and a soldier who understood that in the treacherous courts of the Italian Renaissance, survival depended on more than just a sharp dagger or a heavy purse. It required a mask. The central thesis of his work is the creation of a persona so seamless that it appears entirely natural. He argues that the ideal courtier must possess a quality he christened sprezzatura. It is a difficult word to translate, but it can be understood as a studied carelessness, or the art of concealing art. It is the ability to perform a difficult task, whether fencing or writing poetry or negotiating a treaty, with an air of absolute ease, as if the action required no thought and no effort. This is the foundational philosophy of old money. The author tells us that to labor visibly is to admit weakness. If a man sweats while he works, he proves he is a servant to the task. If a man brags about his wealth, he admits he is surprised by his own possession of it. Castiglione writes that true art is that which does not seem to be art, and that we must use every artifice to hide the artifice. This paradox is the key to understanding the aesthetic and the psychology of the hereditary elite. The goal is to make the acquisition of power look like a happy accident, and the maintenance of wealth look like a burden borne with light-hearted grace. When we observe the modern behavior of dynastic families, we see sprezzatura woven into the fabric of their daily existence. It is present in the refusal to dress perfectly. The pristine suit is the uniform of the man who needs the loan, while the frayed collar or the patched tweed jacket is the prerogative of the man who owns the bank. This is a lesson taken directly from the court of Urbino. Castiglione warned against affectation and the desperate desire to impress. The aristocracy learned that to be truly impressive, one must appear indifferent to the opinion of others. We see this in the architecture of their private lives. The great estates of the Gilded Age, with their marble floors and gold leaf, were often built by new money, anxious to prove its worth. In contrast, the ancestral homes of the truly entrenched elite often cultivate a purposeful shabbiness. The velvet is worn and the rugs are threadbare and the heating is insufficient. This is a calculated signal. It says that we have been here so long that we no longer need to be comfortable to be secure. The psychological insight Castiglione offers is that human beings are naturally suspicious of effort. We resent the man who tries too hard because his ambition makes us anxious, but we are disarmed by the man who smiles and shrugs. We trust the amateur more than the professional because the amateur seems to have nothing to lose. The great dynasties of history have utilized this principle to deflect envy. If one possesses $1 billion, it is dangerous to appear greedy. But if one possesses $1 billion and acts as though it is merely a custodial duty, a boring administrative task that keeps one from one's garden or one's horses, then the public is less likely to sharpen the guillotine. Consider the figure of Gianni Agnelli, the legendary head of Fiat and the uncrowned king of Italy during the 20th century. He was the living embodiment of sprezzatura. He wore his wristwatch over the cuff of his shirt, a gesture that was technically incorrect, yet became a symbol of supreme style. He wore hiking boots with suits. He left his tie askew. These were not mistakes. They were visual declarations that he was above the rules of middle-class correctness. He understood what Castiglione taught 5 centuries prior, which is that strict adherence to rules is a sign of insecurity. By breaking the minor rules, the aristocrat asserts his dominance over the social order. He signals that he writes the code rather than follows it. Agnelli fascinated the public, not because he was rich, but because he seemed to treat his riches with a devastatingly attractive indifference. This philosophy extends beyond fashion into the realm of conversation and intellect. Castiglione advises the courtier to avoid the appearance of being a pedant. He should know everything but display his knowledge only sparingly. When the courtier speaks of philosophy or war, he should do so with a light touch, avoiding the heavy droning of the university professor. We see this trait in the boardrooms of the old banking families of Europe. The Warburgs and the Rothschilds were famous for their silence. They did not raise their voices. They did not use jargon. To speak excessively is to give away one's position. The dynastic leader listens more than he talks, and when he speaks, he often uses humor or understatement to diffuse tension. This is the diplomatic legacy of Urbino. It is the understanding that true authority does not need to shout. There is a darker undercurrent to Castiglione's advice, which appeals to the survival instincts of the wealthy. The courtier is ultimately a creature of adaptation. He molds himself to the whims of the prince. In the modern context, the prince is the market, or the electorate, or the shifting geopolitical landscape. The rigid man snaps when the wind changes, but the man of sprezzatura is flexible. He flows like water. This is why the oldest families are often the most politically ambiguous. They do not cling to ideologies that might drag them down. They cling to survival. They maintain a graceful neutrality that allows them to endure revolutions and wars and market crashes. They are pleasant to everyone and committed to no one. Castiglione also writes of grazia, or grace, which is the celestial cousin of sprezzatura. Grace cannot be learned, it can only be cultivated. It is a quality of movement and spirit that separates the nobility from the merchant class. In the 19th century, the American industrialists sent their daughters to Europe not just to marry titles, but to learn this elusive quality. They understood that money could buy a palace, but it could not buy the way a duchess walked into a room. That had to be absorbed through osmosis and through the study of texts like the Courtier. It is a lesson in the economics of social capital. Hard assets can be seized, but social capital, the ability to charm and command and reassure, is a portable currency that retains its value even in exile. We can look to the life of Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, the French diplomat who served Louis XVI, the French Revolution, Napoleon, the restored Bourbons, and Louis Philippe. He was a man who betrayed everyone and yet was needed by everyone. He was the ultimate courtier. He never hurried. He never panicked. He possessed an exquisite sprezzatura that allowed him to navigate the most violent upheavals in European history while sipping Madeira in his library. Talleyrand understood that the man who remains calm when others are hysterical becomes the natural leader of the room. He practiced the indifference that Castiglione preached. When Napoleon raged at him, Talleyrand merely dusted off his sleeve and remarked on the emperor's lack of manners. This is the power of the high ground. The relevance of Castiglione to the modern inheritor also lies in the management of envy. We live in an age that is hostile to privilege. The wise heir knows that to flaunt his good fortune is to invite destruction. Therefore, he adopts the mask of the courtier. He drives a nondescript car. He speaks of his work as a service to the community. He avoids the flashbulbs of the paparazzi. He uses sprezzatura to make himself invisible. He creates a vague impression of being just like everyone else, even though he is nothing like everyone else. It is a protective camouflage. The quiet luxury trend that captivates social media is merely a commodified, misunderstood version of this ancient survival strategy. The public buys beige cashmere thinking it is a fashion statement. The elite wear beige cashmere because it does not reflect light, and it does not catch the eye. There is a specific passage in the book where the characters discuss the concept of the amateur musician. They conclude that it is better for a nobleman to play the lute well, but to refuse to play it publicly until begged to do so. And even then, he should play with a certain reluctance. This increases the value of the performance. This is the economics of scarcity applied to the self. The dynastic families understand this implicitly. They are rarely seen. They are rarely heard. Their absence creates a vacuum that the public fills with awe. The modern celebrity is overexposed and therefore cheap. The old money figure is underexposed and therefore valuable. Castiglione teaches that the ultimate goal of the courtier is to influence the prince towards virtue. But let us be honest about the application of this text. For 500 years, it has been used to influence the prince towards the interests of the courtier. It is a manual on how to manipulate power by appearing to be a harmless servant of it. It teaches that the velvet glove is always more effective than the iron fist, because the velvet glove leaves no bruises that might incite revenge. As we close the heavy leather cover of this book, we are left with a profound realization about the nature of hierarchy. The world is not divided into the rich and the poor. It is divided into those who sweat and those who do not. Or rather, it is divided into those who show their sweat and those who have mastered the art of concealing it. The Book of the Courtier remains on the nightstands of the powerful not because they wish to learn how to bow or how to dance the galliard. It remains there because it whispers the most important secret of the ruling class. That secret is that reality is malleable. If you can control your face and your voice and your hands, you can control the perception of the world. You can make the difficult look easy. You can make the calculated look natural. And in doing so, you can convince the world that your fortune is not a plunder to be seized, but a grace to be admired. The dynasty survives not by force, but by the magnificent and terrifying art of an effortless performance. In the Italian Renaissance, the court was not a salon floating above reality. It was reality in its most concentrated form. It was where ambition, lineage, patronage, war, art, marriage, credit, and danger were pressed together inside a few rooms. Baldassare Castiglione wrote The Book of the Courtier between the years 1508 and 1516, drawing on discussions set at the court of Urbino, and the structure of the work itself makes plain what kind of world he believed he was describing. This was not a book about decorative niceness. It was a book about the formation of a human instrument fit to survive proximity to power. Its first book turns quickly to grace, affectation, bodily bearing, conversation, martial exercise, and the social impression made by each. Its later books move toward conduct with superiors, the management of reputation, and the relation between the courtier and the prince. Even in the table of contents, the priorities are revealing. One does not begin with sincerity, one begins with control. And it is within this world that Castiglione places the concept that gives the book its lasting power: sprezzatura. He presents it as an essential quality of the ideal courtier, the ability to perform difficult things with such composure that the labor behind them vanishes from sight. It gathers grace, restraint, timing, and self-command into one social art. In court life, where people were judged constantly and mercilessly, sprezzatura was not just attractive, it was protective. To understand sprezzatura, one must begin by stripping away the modern misunderstanding. It is not just elegance, it is not being stylish in a soft, harmless sense. It is not laziness made fashionable. It is not the absence of labor. Castiglione's own formulation is harder and more exacting. He advises the courtier to avoid affectation as though it were a dangerous rock, and to practice a certain nonchalance that conceals design and makes difficult action appear effortless. In the index and commentary tradition surrounding the text, Sprezzatura is identified directly with nonchalance, but that translation can mislead if it suggests passivity. The point is concealment. Art is to be hidden by more art. Labor is to disappear beneath surface ease. Intention is to be masked by apparent naturalness. The finished action must look as though it happened without strain, yet the whole doctrine assumes that strain has already been spent somewhere out of sight. That is why sprezzatura belongs to an aristocratic or royal court before it belongs to aesthetics. In a dangerous society, visible effort carries information. It reveals appetite. It reveals insecurity. It reveals the desire to rise. At court, that can be fatal. The overeager man does not merely annoy. He alerts others to his hunger. He tells them where he wishes to stand. He shows that he needs the prize too badly. In a merchant's ledger, zeal may be useful. In a prince's chamber, it is compromising. Castiglione's courtier must therefore master effortlessness as performance, because the court is a place where every movement is read socially. Speech, dress, wit, restraint, horsemanship, learning, dancing, even the timing of amusement, all become signals in a status-sensitive environment. There is no neutral conduct. There is only conduct that raises or lowers one's standing. Urbino matters here because Castiglione did not set his dialogue in a random palace. He framed it around a court already famous for refinement. The book describes Urbino, praises Duke Federico and his son Guido Baldo, and places at its center a circle gathered under the moral and social authority of Elisabetta Gonzaga, with Emilia Pia guiding the evening's games and conversation. The cast itself tells us that court life was not only military or bureaucratic, it was social in a demanding and theatrical sense. Men and women, nobles, churchmen, diplomats, poets, and soldiers moved through the same enclosed atmosphere. The ideal courtier had to be legible and appealing in all of those registers at once. He could not merely win battles. He had to wear competence lightly among people who were watching for vanity, crudity, and misproportion. This is why affectation appears so early and so forcefully in the argument. Affectation is not just bad taste. It is mismanaged self-presentation. It is effort shown in the wrong way. It is display that exposes the mechanism beneath the gesture. Affected speech is not condemned because it is artificial in some pure philosophical sense. It is condemned because it makes the speaker look needy, studied, eager to impress, or insufficiently secure to trust his own place. Affectation tells the room that the actor is thinking about the audience too much. Sprezzatura, by contrast, is the discipline by which a person makes the audience forget the labor underneath. One might say that affectation is effort leaking through the seams, while sprezzatura is the seal. Castiglione understood that this seal had to cover the whole person. The courtier must be capable in arms. He must ride, fence, wrestle, hunt, move well, and show courage. Yet he must also avoid swagger, boasting, theatrical ferocity, and every vulgar effort to advertise his own manliness. The point is subtle, but severe. Excellence is required, but the advertisement of excellence is distrusted. The courtier is to be first where danger appears, but he is not to bluster. He is to be formidable without seeming drunk on force. In the world of the Italian courts, that balance was not ornamental, it was political. The man who seemed too martial could be read as rough, threatening, provincial, or socially unfit for intimate access. The man who seemed too polished without strength could be read as soft, decorative, or unserious. Sprezzatura solved that tension by turning force into composure. It allowed prowess to appear native to the man rather than anxiously assembled around him. That same logic governs learning. The courtier is not to appear as a pedant. He should know letters, music, and painting, but he must not carry his knowledge like a schoolmaster's burden. This is not anti-intellectualism, it is social calibration. In a courtly setting, too much visible learning can harden into performance and disturb proportion. It can make the learned man seem vain about his own mind, just as over-display in dress can make another man seem vain about his body. Knowledge is useful. The hunger to be seen as knowledgeable is dangerous. The ideal is controlled understatement. The highest accomplishment is not raw possession of culture, but culture absorbed so completely that it seems inseparable from temperament. There is a social cruelty in this, and Castiglione knew it. Sprezzatura favors the person who has already done immense work in private or who has been formed from childhood inside high culture, noble discipline, and courtly rehearsal. What appears natural is often inherited training mistaken for nature. This is one reason courts have always been engines of social reproduction. They reward those who can present cultivation as instinct. A boy raised among rough men might learn to dance, ride, speak elegantly, and quote poetry. But if the learning still clings to him visibly, he risks being read as a climber. The noble-born have an advantage, not because every noble is superior, but because early formation often disappears into the body. The lesson has sunk below conscious display. That is what viewers call grace. Grazia, or grace, therefore stands beside sprezzatura as one of the central ideas in the text. Grace is not simply prettiness. It is the successful impression produced when discipline has disappeared into bearing. Castiglione's world believed that grace could be cultivated, but it also knew that cultivation is most effective when its traces vanish. A graceful person does not seem assembled. He or she seems coherent. Motion, speech, judgment, timing, modesty, and courage all seem to belong together. The person gives the impression of inner order. That impression creates prestige. It invites trust. It calms the room. It suggests that the individual is so well formed that he need not push. This is where self-command enters the story. Courts value self-command because courts are collections of people who cannot afford to be fully frank. Men compete for offices, pensions, benefices, marriages, military commands, access, and intimacy with the ruler. Women at court operate under related but often harsher forms of scrutiny, where speech, gesture, alliance, and rumor can all become instruments of elevation or ruin. In such a setting, mastery of the self is never merely moral. It is tactical. To govern one's face, one's temper, one's pace, and one's appetite is to control the information one leaks into the room. Rage, fear, vanity, lust, resentment, and desperation are all expensive when witnessed too plainly. Sprezzatura is one solution to this problem. It is emotional management made visible as serenity. Guidobaldo da Montefeltro's court gave this ideal special poignancy. Castiglione describes him as physically afflicted by gout, yet admired for the firmness of his spirit and the cultivated quality of his household. That detail matters. A court built around bodily weakness at the top had reason to prize poise, moral force, and social intelligence. It was not a camp of crude conquerors. It was an environment in which command had to be sustained through forms gentler on the surface and no less exacting underneath. Elisabetta Gonzaga's presence also matters for the same reason. The text presents the court not as a barracks, but as a mixed society governed by standards of decorum, wit, modesty, and measured freedom under noble oversight. That structure itself helps explain why visible strain would be marked down. Courtly excellence had to carry itself with ease because the setting rewarded proportion rather than naked force. This is also why the courtier's relation to the prince becomes the book's eventual political core. The ideal courtier is not simply an entertainer. He is a mediator near power. He is meant to influence the prince toward better judgment. Whether history always honored that ideal is another matter, but the model reveals something important. The person who hopes to guide power cannot arrive looking like ambition in its raw form. He must appear disinterested enough to be trusted. He must seem less hungry than those around him. His counsel must come wrapped in tact, timing, and balance. In other words, sprezzatura is not only social camouflage, it is a technology of access. It allows one to become influential while looking unthreatening. The Renaissance courts of Italy gave many examples of this social discipline in action. Isabella d'Este, though more often remembered through Mantua than Urbino, was one of the great managers of symbolic power in the period. She cultivated taste, letters, collecting, conversation, and diplomatic exchange in ways that made cultural authority look like natural superiority. Pietro Bembo, present in Castiglione's dialogue, represented another kind of courtly mastery, one rooted in language, polish, and the ability to turn learning into socially potent form. Giuliano de' Medici carried political exile, lineage, and performance into the same courtly space. These were not people surviving by blunt confession. They moved by calibrated revelation, by style with political consequence, by the management of impression before audiences trained to notice excess. Even the lighter examples in the Book of the Courtier have hard implications. The text lingers on dancing, conversation, games, dress, pleasantry, and music, but always with an eye toward proportion. How much is too much? When is wit indecorous? When does dressing well become vanity? When does laughter become coarseness? When does amusement show low breeding rather than ease? The answer is never mechanical, because the whole theory assumes judgment. That is one reason sprezzatura cannot be reduced to a trick. It depends on reading the room. It is a relational art. It works only when one understands hierarchy, timing, company, and consequence. It is social intelligence embodied. The danger at court was not only disgrace, it was classification. Once a person was classed as a boaster, pedant, upstart, clown, brute, provincial, or fop, the label could settle over him like dust. Then every action confirmed it. Sprezzatura is partly a strategy against being trapped by such categories. By softening display, it keeps one mobile. It prevents talents from becoming caricatures. The brave man avoids looking brutal. The learned man avoids sounding tedious. The amusing man avoids becoming a buffoon. The ambitious man avoids looking desperate. This balance is not mild. It demands continual vigilance. That vigilance is why part one of the story must end not with beauty, but with pressure. The Book of the Courtier is often remembered because people like the glamour of effortless superiority. But Castiglione's world was not glamorous from the inside. It was a world of surveillance, rank, vulnerability, and unstable favor. The courtier had to live under eyes. He had to turn competence into grace because bare competence was not enough. He had to hide effort because exposed effort made him legible as a struggler. He had to avoid affectation because affectation betrayed the workshop beneath the finished object. He had to cultivate self-command because every uncontrolled gesture could become social evidence. He had to gather social capital without looking like a collector of advantage. He had to convert labor into ease and anxiety into polish. That is sprezzatura in its original seriousness. It is not a shrug. It is not aristocratic laziness. It is the disciplined concealment of discipline. It is the making of difficult things look native to the body. It is the art by which a dangerous world is met with smoothness. It is survival strategy transformed into style, and style transformed into symbolic power. The courtier who masters it does not merely look elegant. He reduces envy, calms suspicion, and moves through hierarchy without showing how much hierarchy costs him. In a court, that can mean reputation, influence, protection, and life itself. And from that point onward, the deeper question opens. Why do human beings so often admire what looks natural, even when nature is the least natural thing about it? What Castiglione grasped in the courts of Italy later centuries would keep rediscovering in other languages. Human beings are drawn to the finished surface. They admire the person who makes the difficult thing look light. They trust fluency more readily than strain. They often treat visible effort as evidence of lower rank and hidden mastery as evidence of superiority. The paradox is ancient, but it is not irrational. In status-sensitive worlds, ease suggests command. It suggests reserve, surplus, freedom from panic, freedom from need, and freedom from dependence on the approval of the room. The person who looks hurried, over-explained, over-rehearsed, or eager appears bound to the judgment of others. The person who looks calm appears to own himself. That impression is not everything, but in elite settings it is very close to social currency. This is why sprezzatura did not die with Urbino. It survived because it rests on durable features of social perception. Human beings do not merely judge outcomes, they judge how outcomes are carried. They do not only ask whether a person speaks well, they ask whether the person seems to be trying to speak well. They do not only ask whether a woman enters a room beautifully, they ask whether she appears conscious of her own entrance. They do not only ask whether a man is intelligent, they ask whether his intelligence has to announce itself. Visible strain can disturb the observer because it reveals friction. It tells us that the polished surface has a workshop behind it. It reminds us of effort, ambition, sweat, insecurity, repetition, and rehearsal. The finished product is loved partly because the making has been hidden. The court of Urbino gave this pattern its most elegant early language. Modern research gives it a different kind of proof. Before we move on, it is worth stepping briefly away from palaces, ambassadors, and noble households to look at what sociology and high-performance research have discovered about the same basic phenomenon. Castiglione described it from the inside as a man of courts. Modern researchers describe it from the outside by studying how excellence is built. Their language is less aristocratic, but their conclusions often point in the same direction. What appears natural is very often the final appearance of something long trained, corrected, repeated, and absorbed into the body. That hidden making is what later performance research helps explain. Jeff Colvin, drawing on the literature around high achievement, insists that world-class performance is not best explained by magical gifts, but by deliberate practice, the hard and structured cultivation of specific skills over time. He stresses that great performance comes not from vague experience alone, but from focused effort aimed at improving particular weaknesses, often with feedback, repetition, and constant stretching beyond one's current level. Daniel Chambliss, working from elite swimming, arrives at a related truth from a different angle. Excellence, he argues, is mundane. It is not a glittering secret. It is the repeated doing of many small things correctly, the accumulation of qualitative differences in habit, technique, and standards until superiority looks almost natural from the outside. He also warns that the language of talent often mystifies what is, in fact, built slowly and concretely. Here, the inner mechanism of sprezzatura comes into focus. The courtly ideal depends on what Colvin and Chambliss describe, even though they are writing in modern vocabularies. A graceful social performance is usually not the absence of labor, but labor that has disappeared into form. The poised speaker has often practiced how to frame thought without clutter. The elegant writer has often repeated the same corrections until the body no longer appears to be learning. The person whose conversation seems spontaneous may have spent years absorbing literature, manners, timing, and social distinctions until they become fluid. The observer sees only the last stage. He sees the fluent sentence, the unforced posture, the perfectly judged silence, the easy laugh, the gesture that lands without awkwardness. He does not see the dead drafts, the embarrassing early versions, the corrections, the private rehearsal, the embarrassment, the discipline of self-editing. Sprezzatura is admired because people are looking at the flower and not the root. This has a psychological basis. Ease is cognitively seductive. The mind tends to value fluency. Things that are processed smoothly often feel truer, better, safer, or more beautiful than things that arrive with friction. The person who speaks with calm economy can therefore seem more authoritative than the person who is equally right but visibly straining. This is not always fair, but it is common. In elite life, the effect is intensified because status groups are highly sensitive to manner. Understatement reads as confidence because it implies one does not need to force the point. A person secure in rank, money, culture, or office can afford not to crowd the room. That is one reason visible effort often lowers perceived status. It suggests dependence. It suggests that the approval of the audience matters urgently. It suggests that the performer is still trying to arrive. That does not mean that all visible effort is punished in every setting. On the contrary, modern democratic culture often praises hard work, hustle, and explicit striving. But elite circles have long operated by a more selective code. They want proof of discipline without the vulgarity of obvious self-manufacture. They are willing to honor work, but preferably after the work has already been absorbed into ease. This is one of the hardest social facts for outsiders to accept. They assume that excellence will be rewarded most when it appears most effortful, most intense, most publicly earned. Yet in high-status environments, visible strain can cheapen the result. It can make a fine performance feel socially loud. The ideal is not to eliminate discipline, but to aestheticize it. This is where impression management enters the argument. In the broad sociological sense, all social life involves the management of appearances. People are always presenting versions of themselves to audiences. But courts, aristocracies, salons, diplomatic circles, and upper-class households turn that ordinary fact into a refined art. There, impression management is not a side issue. It is part of survival, sorting, and rule. Sprezzatura is one of its highest forms because it converts management into apparent naturalness. The manager disappears. The self seems whole, native, seamless. This creates prestige. Prestige differs from raw power. It is the willing deference others give when they believe a person possesses superior form, taste, judgment, or composure. It is softer than coercion and often more durable. A prince may command obedience, but a figure with prestige shapes imitation. Sprezzatura is one of the engines that produces that imitation. Prestige also has a social advantage that sheer display does not. It reduces envy. Flaunted effort says, "Look at me achieving." Flaunted wealth says, "Look at me possessing." Both can provoke hostility. Effortless excellence is more cunning. It presents superiority as a condition rather than an act of aggression. The talented hostess who appears merely serene, the statesman who appears merely measured, the old family heir who appears merely undisturbed, all benefit from this softer presentation. Their position seems less like conquest and more like atmosphere. That lowers resistance. It makes hierarchy easier to live with. Power naturalized as temperament is often easier to accept than power displayed as appetite. Elite history offers many examples of this phenomenon. Consider Prince Clemens von Metternich in the 19th century. He moved through diplomatic society with the cultivated ease of a man who understood that calm bearing could itself be a political instrument. His authority was not based only on office. It also rested on social command, polished speech, composure, and the ability to make complex maneuvering look almost inevitable. Or consider the great salonières of France, women such as Madame Geoffrin in the 18th century, whose influence did not come from open seizure but from the disciplined management of tone, company, invitation, conversation, and cultural legitimacy. The successful salon depended on seeming ease. Guests had to feel that brilliance had assembled itself naturally. Yet behind that atmosphere lay selection, labor, memory, tact, and social design. The room looked spontaneous because someone had worked hard enough to erase the appearance of work. A similar logic surrounded Lord Chesterfield, whose letters are often remembered as manuals of polish. He understood that self-command, measured language, manners, and the appearance of ease were not just niceties. They were tools for moving in a competitive world without provoking immediate resistance. He did not imagine society as a place where naked merit simply shines. He imagined it as a field of impressions, offenses, openings, and silent judgments. A person with too much visible earnestness might be right and still lose ground. A person with proportion, restraint, and social tact could convert average content into superior effect. That may seem cynical, but it is also close observation. This is where Chambliss becomes especially useful. He insists that excellence is qualitative before it is quantitative. The great performer is not simply doing more of the same. He is doing things differently. Habits, technique, preparation, timing, and standards diverge from lower levels, and they diverge so consistently that excellence begins to look mysterious to observers. Yet the mystery is often an illusion created by distance. Visiting coaches, Chambliss notes, looked for some dramatic secret in an elite swimming program and grew bored because they found no spectacle, only repeated attention to ordinary details done correctly again and again until excellence became habitual. This is one of the deepest explanations of sprezzatura that modern social science can offer. What appears effortless is often only invisible habit at a very high level. The elite version of this process extends beyond technical skill into emotional control. Self-command is not just a moral ornament, it is a practiced faculty. The ability to remain measured while insulted, to answer lightly when challenged, to keep one's face still while hearing dangerous news, to move slowly in rooms where others rush. All of this can be cultivated. Diplomatic memoirs, aristocratic etiquette, military education, and upper-class schooling have long converged on the same point. Composure is trainable. It is not merely temperamental. Children raised in status-conscious worlds often learn from a young age what not to reveal, how not to overreact, how to speak across rank, how to absorb embarrassment, how to make a refusal feel mild, how to give offense without seeming coarse, how to receive offense without seeming wounded. Later observers call this breeding. In practice, it is often early and repeated training in emotional style. This helps explain why people admire those who make difficult things look natural. They are not only admiring the surface, they are responding to what the surface implies. It implies hidden order. It implies a surplus of control. It implies that the person is so well furnished inwardly that outward strain is unnecessary. In social life, as in aesthetics, people often confuse the sign of mastery with the essence of mastery. A polished speaker may be assumed to have a better mind than a halting one. A graceful host may be assumed to have a finer soul than a flurried one. That is often inaccurate. But status orders do not need to be perfectly accurate to be powerful. They only need shared reading habits. Sprezzatura survives because people keep reading ease as superiority. The relation to social capital is direct. Social capital is the store of trust, connection, familiarity, and reputational credit that lets people move more effectively through institutions and circles. Sprezzatura can generate it because ease reassures. It lowers the social temperature. It makes others feel that being near this person will not be chaotic or embarrassing. One wants to invite again the guest who never strains the atmosphere, never performs his own ambition too loudly, never needs applause after every remark. That person accumulates invitations, introductions, confidences, and quiet preference. Over time, what looks like charm becomes structure. Connections gather around those who are easiest to absorb into elite settings. The same thing happens with symbolic power. Symbolic power is the ability to define what seems normal, admirable, tasteful, or naturally superior. Sprezzatura contributes to that power because it makes a style of being look self-evidently better rather than historically produced. There is another psychological reason visible effort lowers status in these worlds. It disrupts the illusion of inevitability. Elites often prefer authority to look organic. They want inherited position, cultivated taste, educational privilege, and social confidence to appear as if they simply belong together. The minute effort becomes too visible, the arrangement starts to look manufactured. Then viewers may ask uncomfortable questions. How much coaching made that accent? How much tutoring produced that ease with books? How many generations of servants, schools, houses, clubs, and exclusions sit behind that apparently casual confidence? Hidden labor does not only mean the labor of the individual, it often includes the labor of institutions and lineages. Sprezzatura conceals both. This is why, apparently, natural polish can carry such force in plutocratic and aristocratic settings. It launders history through style. It allows social advantages to present themselves as personal qualities. The old house looks unforced. The voice sounds native. The cultural references arrive without strain. The children seem simply at home among paintings, horses, trustees, cousins, and ambassadors. What is, in fact, social reproduction now feels like personality. That transformation is one of the quiet triumphs of elite culture. It is also why outsiders so often misdiagnose what they are seeing. They imagine essence where there has been long formation. Yet part 2 should not end in total cynicism, because the attraction of ease is not only ideological, it also expresses a real human pleasure in finished form. We like the violinist whose bowing no longer looks effortful. We like the good sentence that carries its weight without creaking. We like the athlete who seems to float, the host who makes a difficult evening seem smooth, the diplomat who lowers the temperature of a room by the quality of his bearing. There is something genuinely beautiful in the disappearance of friction. The problem begins when beauty is mistaken for the absence of labor rather than its refinement. That confusion is the social life of sprezzatura. So the deeper sociological explanation is now in view. Sprezzatura is admired because human beings are biased toward fluent surfaces, because status groups reward self-command, because prestige grows around those who seem beyond need, because visible strain suggests dependence, because hidden discipline often looks like superiority, and because elites have long learned to convert formation into apparent nature. Deliberate practice and the mundanity of excellence give the hidden mechanics. Impression management explains the staging. Prestige explains the reward. Social capital explains the accumulation. Symbolic power explains why the style begins to define what excellence itself is supposed to look like. That leaves one final tension before the story moves forward. If apparent naturalness is frequently the endpoint of invisible labor, then aristocratic ease is not the opposite of discipline. It is often its most successful mask. The question, then, is what happens when that mask leaves the Renaissance court and enters the later worlds of old money, dynastic wealth, industrial elites, upper-class domestic life, and modern plutocracy. When power no longer wears a sword at Urbino, how does it continue to wear effortlessness? That is where part 3 begins. When Sprezzatura leaves the court of Urbino, it does not disappear. It changes costume. The sword becomes a walking stick, then a hunting crop, then a city umbrella, then nothing at all. The prince's chamber becomes the salon, the country house, the embassy drawing room, the club, the boardroom, the yacht deck, the private school corridor, the discreetly managed family office. yet the underlying performance remains strikingly familiar. The old lesson survives. Power is easier to live with when it looks like temperament. Privilege is easier to defend when it looks like calm. Labor is easier to hide when its results appear as ease. Sprezzatura moves forward through aristocracy, old money, plutocracy, and modern elite life because the social rewards attached to it never vanish. They simply attach themselves to new materials. One of the clearest places to see this is dress. Old elites have long preferred clothing that suggests confidence without overstatement. This is not because they are indifferent to appearance. On the contrary, they often care with extraordinary precision, but the care must not look recent, frantic, or over-explained. In many upper-class worlds, the ideal garment is not the most visibly expensive object in the room. It is the thing that sits naturally on the body, that does not scream purchase, that may even look slightly imperfect in a way that signals long familiarity with possession. This is why old riding coats, worn tweeds, unshowy cashmere, perfectly cut but unadvertised tailoring, and the strange authority of clothes that seem a little too relaxed for the occasion have carried such weight in elite Europe. They imply that the wearer does not need clothing to do social violence on his behalf. The clothes are there, often of very high quality, but they have been taught to speak softly. Gianni Agnelli remains one of the great modern examples. He was not old money in the hereditary landed aristocratic sense, yet he belonged to a dynastic industrial elite that learned many of the same codes. Agnelli dressed with an air of studied irregularity that became world-famous precisely because it looked unstudied. The watch over the shirt cuff, the tie handled with just enough looseness, the work boots with tailoring, the combination of luxury and slight disruption, all created the impression of a man too secure to be obediently correct. That was the point. He was not dressing badly. He was demonstrating rank through selective indifference. Correctness in its middle-class form can signal anxious effort. Agnelli used misalignment to signal command. He dressed as if rules existed but were no longer binding on him in the same way they were binding on others. That is sprezzatura after the factory age. Labor, money, and immense corporate machinery disappear into a look that feels almost casual. Yet Agnelli's ease was not simply visual, it was social and vocal. He moved through rooms with the authority of someone who did not need to occupy all available space. He could be witty, elliptical, amused, and socially quick without seeming overeager to dominate. That style matters because modern elites often preserve legitimacy through tone rather than declaration. A nervous millionaire speaks too much. A dynastic figure can afford understatement. Agnelli's public image worked because it turned industrial and financial scale into personal style. Fiat, family continuity, political influence, and upper-class cultivation all settled into one embodied performance. He looked less like a man manufacturing power than like a man born at home inside it. The same principle appears in old landed aristocracy, especially in Britain, where restraint long became one of the most effective class signals. The great English and Scottish houses developed an ethic in which overt display could actually lower one's standing if it looked too fresh, too polished, too eager to impress. There is a reason so many country houses cultivated a surface of accidental grandeur. Silver may be old rather than glittering. Furniture may be worn rather than immaculate. Dogs may move through rooms that hold paintings worth fortunes. Boots may sit near portraits. The effect is not carelessness. It is domesticated magnificence. Wealth has been in the house so long that it no longer needs to introduce itself formally. That atmosphere naturalizes power. It suggests continuity, inheritance, and a relation to money very different from acquisition in the raw. Money is present, but possession has been converted into environment. The Cavendish family, Dukes of Devonshire, are a useful example. Chatsworth is one of the grandest houses in England, visibly magnificent and historically central. Yet the culture around such houses has often depended on making colossal possession feel curiously habitable and untheatrical from within. Aristocratic authority is strengthened when grandeur seems normal to its owners. That is one reason the country house ideal has often mixed beauty with practicality, ceremony with muddy dogs, lineage with an almost anti-show language of domestic routine. The family that appears impressed by its own house has already lost some ground. The stronger position is to inhabit splendor without announcing that it is splendor. Again, effort has been buried. Maintenance, staffing, conservation, protocol, and generational wealth preservation are all immense undertakings, but the visible result is ease. This pattern carried into American upper-class life, though with some distortion because the United States had both old families and ambitious new fortunes trying to imitate or absorb older codes. The Gilded Age is often remembered through spectacle, and rightly so. New fortunes built houses of aggressive magnificence because architecture could do declarative work for people whose social position was still unstable. But precisely inside that world, one can also see the rise of restraint as a higher status language. The Astors matter here. Whatever the complications of lineage and change, the Astor name became attached not merely to money but to social control, especially through Caroline Schermerhorn Astor's role in organizing New York society. Mrs. Astor's power did not rest on shouting wealth. It rested on gatekeeping, selection, invitation, and the calm violence of social inclusion or exclusion. This is a classic sprezzatura move at the level of class structure. She did not need to advertise supremacy crudely when she could define the room in which supremacy would be recognized. The same is true of J.P. Morgan, though in a more masculine and financial register. Morgan was a banker of tremendous force, but he understood that authority in high finance was enhanced by solidity rather than flamboyance. His public bearing, heavy and controlled, conveyed weight. He did not need the social nervousness of the striver. He could appear almost immovable. That mattered. In elite worlds, immovability often reads as legitimacy. It suggests that one's position is not up for discussion. Morgan's art collections, club memberships, houses, and patronage tied him to a broader culture of upper-class seriousness in which taste and command reinforced each other. He was not performing urban flash, he was performing permanence. Later, American dynastic figures often refined this further. David Rockefeller offers one of the clearest modern cases. He carried one of the most charged surnames in the world, yet his public style was notable for measured speech, reserve, institution building, philanthropy, and an almost studied aversion to theatrical self-dramatization. The effect was powerful. Enormous inherited structures, financial history, political access, and social capital were presented through moderation. He looked like a steward rather than a conqueror. That distinction is central to elite self-preservation. The steward is easier to tolerate than the victor, even when both sit on top of immense advantages. Sprezzatura, in the world of dynastic capitalism, often means making ownership look like custodianship. Bunny Mellon brought the same principle into another register. Her taste, gardens, houses, and decorative choices became legendary not because they shouted money but because they made exquisite judgment appear serene and inevitable. She was surrounded by privilege and operated inside one of the most refined American upper-class circles of the 20th century. Yet what people repeatedly observed was the lightness of hand, the avoidance of visual noise, the refusal of crude luxury. This is not morally innocent. Refined understatement still depends on resources unavailable to most people. But socially, it is brilliant. It transforms expenditure into atmosphere and privilege into delicacy. The viewer no longer sees cost first, he sees taste. That shift is one of the classic operations of symbolic power. European aristocracy supplies still older examples of the same process. Consider the princely houses and noble families that survived the 19th and 20th centuries, not only through legal adaptation and marriage strategy, but through behavioral continuity. In many of these circles, one of the most admired qualities remained a certain coolness under pressure, an easy relation to ceremony, and the ability to make inherited distinction look free of self-consciousness. This is why elite schools, finishing institutions, regimented childhoods, and highly coded domestic environments mattered so much. They trained children to handle forks, horses, introductions, languages, titles, servants, and silences without visible effort. What outsiders later described as natural breeding was often merely long social drilling that had become bodily second nature. Queen Elizabeth II, though belonging to monarchy rather than merely aristocracy, displayed this principle with unusual clarity. Whatever one thinks of monarchy as an institution, her public authority depended heavily on understatement, emotional control, repetitive discipline, and the performance of continuity without visible strain. The sheer labor behind that steadiness was immense. Decades of appearances, boxes of state papers, ritual obligations, constitutional nuance, and ceaseless scrutiny had to be absorbed into a manner that suggested reliability without theatrics. That is a late modern version of sprezzatura under extreme pressure. The institution's survival depended in part on making duty look natural. Princess Grace of Monaco offers an illuminating contrast because she entered one elite world from another route. As Grace Kelly, she had Hollywood glamour, which is often built on visible staging. As Princess Grace, she had to inhabit dynastic and ceremonial Europe, where overperformed glamour could easily become vulgar. Her later image relied on calm elegance, controlled speech, stillness, and the conversion of beauty into poise. The transformation was not magical. It involved training, adaptation, and the management of presentation across different status systems. What appeared effortless on film and in palace life was built through strenuous discipline of gesture and image. This is one reason elite leisure matters so much. Sports like riding, sailing, shooting, tennis, and skiing have often functioned as theaters in which the body performs control without visible panic. The ideal upper-class sportsman is not merely good, he is unworried. He does not seem to be fighting himself. Even when his performance is technically strong, it must not look grasping. Leisure here is not the opposite of hierarchy. It is one of hierarchy's finest rehearsal spaces. Children learn balance, timing, command, losing without collapse, winning without vulgar celebration, and moving through exclusionary institutions as though they were natural landscapes. Apparent ease in leisure then bleeds into speech, career, marriage, and leadership. Old money restraint becomes especially clear when contrasted with anxious display. New wealth, insecure wealth, or socially unabsorbed wealth often leans toward visible proof. Logos, oversized houses, loud hospitality, over-designed interiors, over-talking, over-explaining, and a desperate need to have value noticed are all signs that possession has not yet become ease. There is often enormous real achievement behind such display. But status worlds do not reward achievement alone. They reward the style in which achievement is worn. This is why some of the richest people in a room can still read as socially smaller than a less visibly rich person whose bearing implies a longer and calmer relation to abundance. The comparison between Vanderbilt excess and old New York restraint illustrates the point. The Vanderbilts built some of the most extravagant houses in American history. The scale itself announced triumph. Yet within the social hierarchy of the period, money alone did not settle rank. Families and individuals who better mastered understatement, alliance, schooling, marriage, cultural patronage, and the avoidance of social overexertion could sometimes appear higher even when they were not richer. Sprezzatura thus helps explain a recurring historical mystery. Why are some wealthy people feared, some envied, some mocked, and some quietly obeyed? The answer often lies not in fortune alone, but in how fortune has been translated into manner. This translation extends to speech. Old elites have often preferred the sentence that lands lightly. They distrust overstatement because overstatement reveals investment in audience reaction. In many aristocratic and upper-class circles, the ability to say less, to imply, to joke dryly, to refuse melodrama, to remain verbally sparse under provocation, becomes a strong marker of status. The person who explains himself too much looks as though he needs to be believed. The person who understates seems to assume belief. That assumption is socially powerful. It saves face, discourages challenge, and creates an aura of self-possession. This is one reason upper-class understatement has been so persistent in British, European, and certain American elite traditions. It is not merely a tone. It is a politics of self-presentation. The same can be said of discretion. Dynastic families and established elites often survive not only because they possess assets, but because they make their operations look boring, private, and almost administrative. Family offices, trusts, estate structures, boards, interlocking directorships, educational pipelines, and marriage strategies can carry enormous consequence while remaining hidden behind a curtain of normality. The family appears reserved. The labor of continuity remains invisible. This invisibility matters because it softens public hostility. If power looks like administration rather than appetite, people resist it less quickly. Sprezzatura here is not only aesthetic, it is institutional. It is the masking of machinery beneath calm surface. Consider the great industrial and financial families that learn to endure by lowering their profile. Public flamboyance can attract regulation, resentment, scandal, and intrusion. Quiet foundations, discreet board service, carefully managed philanthropy, and cultivated seriousness perform a different function. They make concentrated power look responsible rather than hungry. This does not erase domination. It merely changes its emotional texture. The same structural advantages remain, but they are sheathed in calm. That calm also helps normalize inherited structures. If the heir seems merely well-mannered, educated, tasteful, self-contained, and slightly reluctant to discuss his privilege, then the privilege itself begins to look less like a historical arrangement and more like a personal temperament. This is one of the deepest uses of sprezzatura in old money worlds. It turns structure into style. It helps make class look like personality. It persuades observers that the ruling type is simply a certain kind of person rather than the product of schools, houses, money, inheritance law, and generations of selective marriage and cultural grooming. None of this means that old elites never fail. They fail constantly. They can become stale, theatrical, lazy, careless, decadent, or ridiculous. The performance of ease can curdle into actual indifference. The refusal of visible effort can become incompetence. Aristocratic codes can become parody. Yet even those failures prove the rule. When elites are mocked, they are often mocked precisely because they have lost control of the balance between discipline and ease. They either show too much machinery or too little substance. The art lies in appearing natural while remaining highly organized underneath. That is why sprezzatura remains alive in modern plutocracy, fashion, politics, media, and elite philanthropy. The billionaire in a plain sweater, the dynastic heir in scuffed shoes, the cultural patron who acts slightly embarrassed by magnificence, the executive who never appears hurried, the hostess who makes an impossible guest list feel accidental, the family that treats assets as stewardship rather than conquest, all are working variations on the same old theme. Their calm is often real in part and rehearsed in part. Their understatement is often sincere in part and strategic in part. But strategy and sincerity do not cancel each other here. Elite style has always fused them. The old courtier wanted difficult things to look easy, because court life punished visible striving. The old money heir wants power to look temperamental, tasteful, and unforced because modern life punishes naked domination more than older worlds did. The forms have changed, but the logic is continuous. Effort is still hidden. Labor is still buried beneath finish. Prestige still grows around those who seem beyond need. Envy is still reduced when possession is translated into calm. Authority is still easier to exercise when it looks like personal bearing rather than social machinery. In the end, sprezzatura survives because it answers a permanent ruling class problem. How do you hold advantage without making advantage look too violent? How do you display superiority without provoking immediate revolt? How do you make immense cultivation, wealth, education, and inherited structure appear not as weapons but as atmosphere? The answer, from Urbino to the country house, from the salon to the boardroom, from dukes to industrial dynasties, has often been the same. You make the achieved look innate. You make the trained look natural. You make the guarded look easy. You convert labor into grace and power into manner, until the world begins to believe that what was built over generations was simply there all along. The Renaissance court was not a place of unguarded feeling. It was a theater of controlled perception, where every glance, every hesitation, every carefully chosen word carried the weight of reputation, favor, and survival. In this world, love was never merely a private emotion. It was a public performance conducted under the unblinking surveillance of rivals, servants, patrons, and allies. To love openly was to expose oneself. To desire visibly was to hand one's enemies a weapon. And so the courtier learned, perhaps above all else, the art of concealment. Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, published in 1528, is often read as a manual of elegance and refinement. It describes the ideal gentleman and lady, their accomplishments, their manners, their grace. But beneath its polished surface lies something more ruthless. The book is a guide to survival in a world where status is unstable, where favor is fleeting, and where the wrong word can destroy a lifetime of careful construction. Nowhere is this more evident than in its treatment of love, courtship, and the management of desire. The court of Urbino, where the dialogues are set, was a compressed social world. Its inhabitants lived in constant proximity, their lives entangled by blood, alliance, ambition, and obligation. In such an environment, privacy was an illusion. Every gesture was observed. Every relationship was subject to interpretation. A lover who declared himself too openly invited not only ridicule but political damage. A woman who responded too eagerly risked her reputation forever. The cost of visibility was simply too high. Castiglione understood this intimately. The courtier he describes is not a man who acts on impulse. He is a man who calculates. He must learn to read the room, to gauge the disposition of his prince, to measure the character of those around him. He must speak with precision, move with deliberation, and above all, he must never appear to be trying too hard. Grace, in this system, is the art of making effort invisible. And love, perhaps more than any other human activity, demands this art. The text is remarkably explicit about the dangers of directness. The court lady is advised to feign ignorance when a gentleman speaks of love, to deflect his words into other meanings, to treat his declarations as jokes or compliments rather than serious advances. She must preserve a modest ambiguity, neither encouraging nor entirely discouraging. This is not coyness for its own sake. It is a defensive strategy in a world where a woman's honor is her most fragile asset. To be seen as too accessible is to invite predation. To be seen as too cold is to forfeit favor. The middle path is the only safe one, and it requires constant vigilance. For the courtier, the rules are no less exacting. He must reveal his love through manner rather than words, through sighs and glances rather than declarations. His eyes must serve as messengers, carrying the embassies of his heart without the risk of explicit confession. This is not mere romantic convention. It is a calculated response to the reality that speech, once uttered, cannot be recalled. A glance can be denied. A sigh can be attributed to fatigue or melancholy. But a spoken declaration is evidence. It can be repeated. It can be used against him. The courtier who values his position learns to say nothing that cannot be unsaid. This reliance on indirection creates a world of intermediaries. The courtier cannot speak directly to his beloved, so he must speak through others. A trusted friend, a servant, a relative, a go-between can carry messages while preserving deniability. A letter can be intercepted, but a whispered word in the ear of a confidant leaves no trace. This is not merely a practical solution to the problem of surveillance, it is a structural feature of court society. Direct communication is a privilege reserved for those who have nothing to hide. In a world where everyone has something to hide, intermediaries become essential. The system also depends on a shared understanding of what is being said, even when nothing is being stated explicitly. The courtier learns to speak in layers, to say one thing while meaning another, to leave his words open to interpretation so that he can later disavow them if necessary. This is not deception in the crude sense. It is a form of social fluency, a recognition that meaning is always negotiated, never fixed. The courtier who masters this art can move through the most dangerous conversations without ever committing himself. He can test the waters, probe the intentions of others, and retreat without loss if the situation turns against him. The psychological demands of this way of life are considerable. To live in a state of constant concealment is to develop a kind of hypervigilance. One becomes attuned to the subtlest shifts in tone, expression, and posture. One learns to read between the lines, to interpret pauses, to detect the hidden currents beneath the surface of polite conversation. This is not paranoia. It is a necessary skill in an environment where information is power and where the wrong interpretation can be fatal. Castiglione's courtier is not merely cautious, he is disciplined. He must control not only his words but his very emotions. The passionate lover who weeps and wails is not admirable, he is pathetic. The courtier who cannot govern his heart cannot govern his face, and the man who cannot govern his face has no place at court. This is not repression in the modern psychological sense. It is a form of training. The courtier learns to feel without showing, to desire without demanding, to love without losing himself. In a world where vulnerability is dangerous, self-command becomes the highest virtue. The gendered dimension of this system is impossible to ignore. The court lady is held to a stricter standard than the courtier. Her honor is more fragile, her reputation more easily damaged. She must be chaste, but not prudish. She must be approachable, but not accessible. She must inspire love without encouraging license. This is a nearly impossible balance, and it requires an almost superhuman degree of self-control. The courtier, by contrast, has more latitude. He can pursue love without the same risk of social death. But even he must operate within constraints. A man who is too forward, too persistent, too visible in his desires will be seen as crude, vulgar, and ultimately unworthy of the society he seeks to enter. The courtly system of secrecy and indirection is often romanticized as a kind of elegant game, but it was never merely a game. It was a method of survival. The courtier who failed to conceal his passions risked not only humiliation but ruin. The woman who misjudged the line between modesty and availability risked everything. In this environment, the ability to hide one's feelings was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Castiglione's book is sometimes dismissed as a relic of a vanished world, but its insights into the nature of social power remain surprisingly relevant. The court of Urbino may be gone, But the logic of elite life has not changed so much as we might like to think. In any world where status is precarious and visibility is dangerous, the ability to manage perception becomes essential. The courtier's art of concealment is not a historical curiosity. It is a permanent feature of life in the upper reaches of society. The Book of the Courtier teaches us that secrecy is not the opposite of intimacy. It is the condition that makes intimacy possible. In a world of surveillance, directness is a luxury that few can afford. The lovers of Urbino could not speak openly, so they learned to speak in code. They could not act directly, so they learned to act through intermediaries. They could not reveal their hearts, so they learned to reveal just enough to be understood. This is not deception. It is the language of a world where vulnerability is the greatest risk of all. The court was a machine for the production of elegance, but elegance, in this system, is simply danger made beautiful. The grace of the courtier is the grace of a man who has learned to walk through a room full of traps without stepping on one. The charm of the court lady is the charm of a woman who has learned to smile while calculating the cost. The etiquette, the manners, the elaborate rituals of courtship, all of it exists to manage the fundamental reality of court life, that everyone is watching, that everything matters, and that the smallest misstep can be fatal. Secrecy was not an accident of court culture. It was its operating principle, and those who mastered it did not merely survive, they rose. In the spring of 1528, an obscure Venetian press issued a book that would quietly shape the inner life of the European ruling class for centuries. Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier was not a work of philosophy, nor a military treatise, nor a manual of manners. It was something more dangerous and more durable. It was a blueprint for the production of a human type, the balanced humanist, the aristocratic generalist, the man who could fight, speak, sing, paint, reason, charm, and command without ever appearing to strain toward any of these things. At the court of Urbino, where the dialogues are set, a small circle of lords, ladies, prelates, and soldiers spent 4 evenings debating the question of perfection in a gentleman. Their answers became the secret curriculum of elite formation for generations. The book did not merely describe a servant of princes. It described how a ruling class learns to rule itself. The central claim of Castiglione's masterpiece is radical in its refusal of specialization. The ideal courtier is not a warrior who happens to read. He is not a scholar who happens to ride. He is not a musician who happens to fight. He is all of these things at once, and the unity of these parts is the entire point. The first book of the courtier makes this unmistakable. The courtier's principal and true profession is arms. He must be bold, strong, loyal, and skilled in every weapon, every mount, every martial exercise from wrestling to vaulting to the management of a duel. He must understand war not as abstract strategy, but as embodied readiness. Yet immediately, Castiglione complicates this martial foundation. The courtier must also be graceful. He must avoid affectation as if it were a sharp rock. He must move through physical challenges with an ease that conceals the immense labor behind his competence. This is the first lesson of elite formation. Power without elegance repels. Strength that announces itself too loudly becomes vulgar. The true nobleman fights as if fighting were the most natural thing in the world, and he does so in full view of those who matter. But arms alone are insufficient. The courtier must be more than passably accomplished in letters. He must be versed in the humanities, in poets and orators and historians, in Latin and Greek, in the composition of verse and prose. He must write well enough to judge the writing of others. He must be able to move through a conversation about Caesar's campaigns, then quote Petrarch, then turn a compliment to a lady with the structure of a classical oration. Castiglione is not describing a dilettante. He is describing a mind that has been shaped by the deepest currents of European learning. The courtier reads because reading refines judgment. He writes because writing teaches him to recognize industry, style, and the hidden architecture of great work. He studies antiquity not to retreat from the world, but to return to it with sharper eyes. The illiterate nobleman, however brave, is a cripple. He cannot fully participate in the conversation of his class. He cannot recognize the references that signal belonging. He cannot wield the cultural authority that makes raw power appear legitimate. Then comes music. The courtier must play instruments and understand harmony. This is not ornament. Music, for Castiglione and his circle, is a force that tames wild beasts, stirs Alexander the Great to rage or calm, and lifts the soul toward virtue. The ancients taught music to their warriors because it ordered the spirit. The courtier who disdains music reveals an ill-tuned soul. He is incomplete. And because courts are filled with women whose delicate spirits are penetrated by harmony, the musical courtier also gains access to the social world where favor is won and lost. Music is not entertainment. It is a technology of influence. The same logic applies to painting. The courtier must know how to draw, how to see, how to judge the beauty of bodies, statues, buildings, and landscapes. Painting teaches the eye to discern proportion, light, and the divine order that suffuses creation. More practically, it helps the courtier appreciate the beauty of women with a connoisseur's precision. He who cannot paint will never taste the full pleasure of beauty. He will remain blind to half the currency of courtly exchange. The second book of the courtier shifts from what the ideal man should know to how he should use that knowledge. Tact becomes paramount. The courtier must avoid affectation above all else. He must speak and act with a certain nonchalance, concealing the study and labor behind his accomplishments. He must choose the right time to display his skills and the right time to remain silent. He must dress well but not extravagantly, speak fluently but not pedantically, joke without cruelty, and listen more than he performs. This is where the balanced humanist reveals his political function. He is not merely a refined individual. He is a creature of the court, an organism designed to survive and thrive in an environment of constant scrutiny, envy, and competition. His grace is armor. His conversation is intelligence work. His ability to shift between topics, to read a room, to flatter without fawning, to criticize without offense, all of this makes him useful to a prince. And usefulness to a prince is the whole point. The fourth book makes this explicit. The true fruit of courtiership is not dancing or music or witty conversation. It is the power to guide the prince toward virtue and away from vice. The courtier wins favor through his accomplishments, then uses that favor to speak truth. He becomes the one man in the prince's orbit who can say what others will not. He opposes bad advisors, banishes flatterers, and steers the ruler toward justice, temperance, and magnanimity. This is the highest function of the balanced humanist. He is not a parasite on power. He is the conscience of power, the civilizing force that prevents the prince from degenerating into a tyrant. Castiglione is careful to note that this role requires the courtier to be old enough to have wisdom, yet still capable of winning favor through the physical and social graces of youth. The tension is deliberate. The ideal is almost impossible. That is why it is an ideal. Why would an elite class invest in such a demanding model of formation? Because courts are not battlefields. They are theaters of continuous judgment. A nobleman who can only fight is a weapon, not a political actor. A nobleman who can only quote Latin is a scholar, not a courtier. The man who can do both, and sing, and dance, and paint, and counsel, and command, and do all of this without visible effort, that man is a sovereign presence. He cannot be easily dismissed. He cannot be reduced to a single weakness. He embodies the entirety of his class's aspirations. When such a man enters a room, he carries with him the authority of arms, the legitimacy of learning, the refinement of art, and the self-possession of moral discipline. He is the ruling class made visible. The genius of Castiglione's project is that it transforms every aspect of elite life into training. The hunt teaches the arts of war. Music teaches harmony and proportion. Conversation teaches the reading of character and the management of impression. Painting teaches the appreciation of beauty and the capacity to judge. Even love, handled correctly, becomes a ladder to higher virtue. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is merely recreational. The courtier is always learning, always performing, always becoming more himself. This is formation without end. And because the model is so demanding, it creates a natural hierarchy. Only those born with innate grace, raised in noble houses, and trained by the best masters can hope to approach the ideal. The rest will reveal themselves through their affectation, their roughness, their inability to conceal effort. The book is a filter as much as a guide. The historical setting matters. Urbino, under Duke Federico and later Guidobaldo, was a court famous for its fusion of martial vigor and humanist learning. Federico himself was a condottiere who built one of the finest libraries in Italy. He fought wars and collected manuscripts. He embodied the synthesis Castiglione describes. The interlocutors of the dialogues are not fictional constructs. They are real courtiers, soldiers, prelates, and ladies who lived this ideal. Their debates are not abstract. They are reports from a working experiment in elite formation. When Castiglione writes about grace, about music, about the proper way to wear armor or to address a prince, he is writing from within a living tradition. This is not theory. It is ethnography of the ruling class. Modern elites have largely abandoned this model. Specialization has triumphed. The financier knows finance. The lawyer knows law. The general knows logistics. But the older ideal has never completely died. It survives in the old diplomatic corps, in certain military academies, in the few remaining households where children are still taught to ride, to shoot, to speak 3 languages, to play an instrument, to quote poetry, and to enter a room as if they own it. The balanced humanist is unfashionable, but not extinct. He is the ghost in the machine of hereditary privilege, the memory of a time when the ruling class believed that its right to rule rested not merely on wealth or birth, but on the visible, cultivated excellence of the whole person. Castiglione's book ends with a long discourse on love, spoken by the Venetian humanist Pietro Bembo. Love, Bembo argues, can lift the soul from the beauty of a single body to the beauty of all bodies, and from there to the contemplation of divine beauty itself. This is the final stage of the courtier's education. He moves from arms to letters, from letters to art, from art to philosophy, from philosophy to God. The earthly courtier becomes a channel of heavenly order. Whether any real courtier ever reached such heights is doubtful, but the aspiration is the point. The balanced humanist was never meant to be fully realized. He was meant to be approached, and in that approach, the ruling class found its justification. It did not merely own land and command armies, it cultivated souls. It refined the raw material of power into something that looked, for a moment, like grace. What makes the courtier enduring is that it names a permanent problem in political and social life. Every ruling class must decide what kind of human being it wishes to produce. It can produce technicians, efficient and narrow, capable of managing systems they do not understand as wholes. It can produce entertainers, charming and fluent, who know how to attract attention but not how to deserve authority. Or it can attempt, however imperfectly, to produce complete persons, men and women whose capacities are various enough to keep power from collapsing into appetite or mere administration. Castiglione's answer is aristocratic, but the question is universal. What sort of formation makes a person fit to lead others? What disciplines teach command without brutality, refinement without weakness, seriousness without rigidity? These questions did not disappear with the Renaissance court. They simply migrated into new institutions. The tragedy of modern meritocracy is that it often mistakes measurable competence for human excellence. It can select brilliantly for analysis, ambition, speed, and output, yet remain indifferent to beauty, restraint, courage, style, or moral poise. The result is a governing class that may be highly credentialed while remaining spiritually unfinished. Castiglione understood something that modern systems often forget. An elite is judged not only by what it can do, but by what it is. Its tone, its habits, its standards of speech, its relation to pleasure, honor, and self-command. These shape the moral atmosphere of an entire society. If those at the top are graceless, acquisitive, and inwardly disordered, no amount of procedural efficiency can compensate for the ugliness that follows. The crisis is not simply one of policy, it is one of type. That is why the Book of the Courtier still matters. Not because anyone wishes to restore the court of Urbino, nor because the Renaissance nobleman can be copied wholesale in a democratic age, but because the book preserves an older and more demanding vision of cultivation. It insists that power should be educated, that authority should be beautiful as well as effective, and that the highest human formation joins strength to grace rather than setting them at odds. Castiglione offers no modern program and no simple blueprint. What he offers instead is a standard, almost unbearably high, by which the ambitions of any elite may be measured. Read that way. The Courtier is not a relic, it is a mirror and a rebuke. The voice that reveals rank. The Palace of Urbino, in the foothills of the Apennines, was not a place of idle pleasure. In the early years of the 16th century, it was a pressure chamber. Within its walls, a young man's future turned on a single misplaced word, a laugh that came too quickly, a silence that stretched too long. The Duke Guidobaldo di Montefeltro was a man crippled by gout, unable to stand or move freely, yet his court was the most admired in Italy. He ruled not through physical presence, but through the quality of the company he kept. And that company judged constantly. It is here, in March of 1507, that Baldassare Castiglione sets his dialogues. A diplomat and courtier himself, Castiglione had served Guidobaldo. And after the Duke's death, he wrote what became the most influential manual of elite behavior in European history. The Book of the Courtier was not a book of manners in the trivial sense. It was a survival guide for men who had to breathe the same air as princes, who needed favor to live, and who understood that every conversation was an audition. The central question Castiglione asks is deceptively simple. What is the perfect courtier? But the answer reveals something far darker and more practical. The perfect courtier is not the most learned, or the bravest, or the most handsome. He is the one who knows how to speak. And not just to speak, but to speak in a way that conceals effort, reveals nothing of calculation, and disarms every listener. The gravity of small talk. In modern life, conversation is understood as expression. We speak to convey information, to share feeling, to connect. In Castiglione's world, conversation was none of these things. It was a field of strategic action. The courtier spoke to be judged. Every sentence was evidence of breeding, judgment, self-command, and loyalty. There was no neutral speech. Castiglione begins not with wit, but with grace. In Book 1, Count Ludovico da Canossa, a kinsman of the author who would later become Bishop of Bayeux, opens the discussion by insisting that the courtier must be nobly born. This is not snobbery for its own sake. Noble birth creates an expectation of worth, and that expectation is itself a form of armor. A man of low birth can succeed, Canossa admits, but he will need far more effort and time to make the impression that a gentleman commands in an instant. First impressions, in this world, are not merely important. They are nearly decisive. The court of Urbino understood what social psychology would later formalize as the halo effect, the tendency to assume that a person with one admirable quality possesses others. But Castiglione's insight is more precise. The favorable impression of noble birth is a loan. The courtier must repay it with behavior that confirms the advance, and the most visible form of that behavior is speech. Canossa insists on a certain nonchalance, a quality the Italians called sprezzatura. It is the art of doing difficult things as if they required no effort at all. In conversation, this means speaking with ease, without hesitation, without affectation, without the telltale signs of preparation or anxiety. The courtier who rehearsed his witticisms, who laughed too loudly at his own jokes, who paused too long searching for the perfect word, revealed himself as an outsider. He showed that he was trying, and trying was the great offense. The two kinds of wit. In Book 2, Federico Fregoso, a half-nephew of the Duke who would later become Archbishop of Salerno and a cardinal, takes up the subject more systematically. He distinguishes two kinds of pleasantry. The first is continuous narrative, the ability to tell a story with such grace and precision that listeners feel they are witnessing the event themselves. The second is the quick saying, the sharp retort, the single phrase that turns a conversation. Both forms demand the same underlying capacity, judgment. The courtier must know not only what to say, but when to say it, to whom, in what place, and with what intention. A witticism that would delight the Duke in his private chamber could ruin a man at a formal reception. A humorous story that amuses soldiers might offend ladies. The same words, shifted by context, become either charming or grotesque. Fregoso warns against several errors. First, the courtier must never praise himself openly, even when the praise is deserved. Self-praise, no matter how accurate, excites hatred and disgust. Second, the courtier must avoid the opposite extreme of false modesty, which is equally transparent. Third, he must never speak ill of his lord, a fault that Fregoso describes as raging like a fury in many courts. Those who have been most favored are often the first to complain, and this ingratitude destroys them. The courtier who masters conversation does not merely entertain, he wins favor worthily. Fregoso insists that the best way to gain a prince's favor is to deserve it, but he is not naive about the difficulty. Princes are surrounded by flatterers. They are isolated by power. They rarely hear the truth. The courtier who can speak honestly without giving offense, who can correct his lord's errors gently, who can make virtue seem attractive and vice repulsive, performs a service more valuable than military victory. But this service requires that the courtier first win the prince's affection, and that requires charm. The architecture of charm. Charm is not magic, it is architecture. Castiglione's courtier builds his charm from several materials. The first is physical, a good voice, neither too thin like a woman's, nor too rough like a peasant's, but sonorous, clear, sweet, and well-sounding. The second is behavioral, proper bearing, calm gestures, a face that reflects the speaker's intent without grimacing or contorting. The third is verbal, words that are precise, choice, rich, and rightly formed, but above all, in common use. The courtier who reaches for obscure or antique words, who speaks Florentine when he is not Florentine, who tries to sound more learned than his listeners, commits the sin of affectation, and affectation is the rock on which all charm founders. Castiglione is ruthless about this. He describes men who, after a year away from home, return speaking Roman or Spanish or French, God knows how. He describes dancers who move as if counting every step, their bodies stiff, their faces frozen in concentration, He describes orators who labor over every word, forgetting that art, which appears artless, is the only art worth having. The principle extends beyond speech. In Book 1, Canossa praises the beauty of unadorned women, those who wear no paint, who laugh freely, whose hair is artlessly confined. The woman who paints her face heavily, who dares not laugh for fear of cracking her makeup, who shows herself only by candlelight like a merchant displaying damaged cloth in darkness, reveals her desperation. She wants to be beautiful so visibly that she becomes ugly. The same is true of wit. The courtier who tries too hard to be amusing, who reaches for every joke, who forces laughter from reluctant listeners, reveals his insecurity. He is not confident in his own standing, so he performs. And performance, once detected, is fatal. The court as theater. The court of Urbino was not unique in demanding this level of conversational discipline. Across Europe, courts functioned as theaters in which every word was overheard, every silence interpreted, every gesture recorded. The French court under Louis XIV perfected this art to a terrifying degree. The king's lever, the ceremonial rising from bed, was attended by dozens of nobles who competed for the right to hold a candle or pass a shirt, but the real competition was verbal. A single remark repeated to the king could elevate a family. A single misstep could banish it for generations. The salon culture of 17th and 18th century France carried Castiglione's principles into civilian life. Hostesses like the Marquise de Rambouillet, Julie de Lespinasse, and Suzanne Necker created spaces where wit was the currency of admission. To be invited to the salon was to be judged worthy of conversation. To be excluded was to be pronounced boring, a verdict worse than immorality in that world. The Salonières enforced a code that Castiglione would have recognized instantly. No pedantry, no heavy-handed learning, no boasting, no tedious length, no cruel wit that wounded without purpose. Conversation was to be light without being shallow, serious without being heavy, amusing without being desperate. The English aristocratic tradition, though less formal, demanded the same ease. The country house weekend, that peculiar invention of the Victorian era, was a test of conversational stamina. One had to talk from breakfast, through the long afternoon walk, to the formal dinner, to the evening's games, always with the same people, always under observation. Those who could not sustain conversation, who grew silent or repetitive or nervously garrulous, revealed themselves as lacking the internal resources that breeding was supposed to provide. Castiglione's insight, centuries earlier, was that conversation reveals character more reliably than any other behavior. The voice, he writes, should be calm, the movements measured, the eyes neither wandering nor fixed. The courtier who speaks too fast shows anxiety. The one who speaks too slowly shows dullness. The one who interrupts shows arrogance. The one who never initiates shows timidity. Every mannerism is legible. Everything communicates. The voice that betrays. Consider the case of Robert Walpole, Britain's first Prime Minister, a man who dominated the House of Commons for 2 decades not through oratory but through conversational mastery. Walpole spoke informally, as if to friends, without the rhetorical flourishes that marked his contemporaries. He understood that in politics, as in court life, the appearance of effortlessness is itself a form of power. His great rival, Viscount Bolingbroke, was a far more brilliant speaker, but brilliance drew attention to itself. Walpole's plainness suggested solidity, reliability, the absence of guile. Or consider the diplomatic tradition of the 18th and 19th centuries, in which ambassadors were chosen as much for their conversational skill as for their political knowledge. Prince Metternich, the Austrian chancellor who dominated European diplomacy after the Napoleonic Wars, was famous for his ability to talk for hours without saying anything of consequence, to divert, to charm, to delay, to disarm. His conversations were not exchanges of information, but performances of control. He decided what would be said and what would be withheld, and his listeners often did not realize they had learned nothing until after he had left the room. This is the dark heart of Castiglione's teaching. The courtier's conversation is not a window into his soul. It is a screen. He speaks to manage perception, not to express truth. He is charming not because he is naturally delightful, but because he has learned that delight is useful. And he never forgets that the prince is always watching. The unbearable lightness of ease. Castiglione's most famous concept, sprezzatura, is often translated as nonchalance, but the word carries more weight than that. It implies a kind of aristocratic disdain for effort, the assumption that one's natural gifts are so ample that study would be superfluous. The true courtier does not need to try, because he was born already possessing what others must labor to acquire. This is, of course, a fiction. Castiglione's courtier labors constantly. He practices weapons, riding, wrestling, swimming, dancing, music, painting, classical literature. He studies the art of conversation as a soldier studies tactics, but he must never appear to study. His knowledge must seem innate. His skill must seem effortless. His grace must seem like breathing. The fiction serves a purpose. It preserves hierarchy. If the courtier's excellence appears natural, then his position at the top of the social order also appears natural. He is not there because he worked harder than others. He is there because he was born better. And that belief, maintained through generations of carefully staged nonchalance, is the foundation of aristocratic legitimacy. Castiglione does not state this cynically. He genuinely believed that noble birth tended to produce noble character, that grace was often inherited, that training could only perfect what nature had already begun. But he also knew that nature was not always generous. Some nobles were fools, some commoners were brilliant. The courtier's art, then, was not merely to display his own gifts, but to conceal the gaps, to smooth over the contradictions, to make the social order appear seamless when it was anything but. The stakes could not be higher. A man who revealed himself as trying too hard, who confessed through his strained jokes and forced smiles that he was not quite comfortable in the Duke's presence, who showed even a flicker of anxiety or self-consciousness, was marked as lesser. He did not belong. And in a world where belonging meant favor and favor meant survival, the cost of exposure was ruin. This is why Castiglione's discussion of conversation is not a chapter in a book about manners. It is a chapter in a book about power. The courtier who masters his voice, who learns to speak with ease, who can make the prince laugh without making himself cheap, who can entertain without exhausting, who can advise without offending, holds a weapon more subtle than a sword. He can open doors that force cannot breach. He can survive changes of fortune that crush the merely strong. He can make himself indispensable to rulers who trust no one. In part 2 of this exploration, we will examine the specific forms of wit Castiglione recommends, the dangerous boundary between humor and humiliation, and the way that conversational skill became, across European elite society, a filter more reliable than birth or wealth. Because in the end, the courtier's voice does not just reveal rank, it enforces it. And those who cannot speak the language of power are excluded from its rooms, no matter how much money they bring. The courtier who speaks well has cleared the first hurdle. He has learned to avoid affectation, to hold his voice steady, to let his words fall as if from nature rather than from calculation. But speaking well is only the foundation. The true test comes when he attempts to be amusing. For wit, in the world Castiglione describes, is not a gift one deploys freely. It is a knife. And knives, even in the most skillful hands, can cut the wielder. In Book 2 of The Courtier, the discussion turns to pleasantries and witticisms. The task falls to Bernardo Dovizi da Bibbiena, a man of humble origins who rose to become a cardinal and one of the most feared wits of the Renaissance. Bibbiena is not a neutral observer. He is a practitioner, known across Italy for his sharp tongue and his ability to reduce enemies to rubble with a single sentence. When he speaks about the dangers of humor, he speaks from experience. Bibbiena begins by observing that laughter is peculiar to man. It is a sign of inner hilarity, a release from the weariness of life. But not all laughter is equal. The courtier who seeks to amuse must distinguish between the humor that elevates and the humor that degrades. He must understand that the source of the laughable lies in a kind of distortion, an incongruity that is not quite amiss. We laugh at what is slightly wrong, slightly out of place, slightly exaggerated. But we do not laugh at genuine suffering or at wickedness so black that it demands punishment rather than ridicule. The boundaries of acceptable jest. Bibbiena divides wit into three categories. The first is the humorous narrative, the long story told with such grace that listeners feel they are witnessing the event themselves. This form demands the skill of a good actor, the ability to mimic voices and gestures without descending into buffoonery. The second is the quick saying, the sharp retort, the single phrase that changes the temperature of a room. This form is the gift of nature and intellect, not of art, because a pungent saying must dart forth and hit the mark before the speaker seems to have given it a thought. The third is the practical joke, the friendly deceit that surprises expectation and produces laughter through action rather than words. Each form carries its own perils. The humorous narrative can become tedious if the story is too long or the teller too pleased with himself. The quick saying can wound deeper than intended, turning admiration into fear. The practical joke can cross into cruelty, breaking friendships and ending careers. Bibbiena is relentless in cataloging the mistakes that ruin wit. There are those who say the foulest and most indecent things before honorable ladies, thinking themselves gallant when they are merely offensive. There are those who throw food at one another, who push each other downstairs, who mistake coarseness for joviality. There are those who cannot resist blaspheming, who think a joke about God is the height of cleverness. These men, Bibbiena says, deserve to be chased from the society of every gentleman. The problem is not that wit is dangerous. The problem is that most people who try to be witty lack the judgment to know where the boundaries lie, and the boundaries shift constantly. A joke that delights the Duke may disgust the Duchess. A pleasantry that works in a small gathering of friends may fall flat in a formal reception. A witticism that stings a rival may provoke a duel. The courtier who cannot read the room, who cannot sense the mood of his listeners, who cannot distinguish between those who will laugh and those who will take offense, has no business being amusing at all. The case of the Unico Aretino. No figure in the Courtier illustrates the danger of overreaching more vividly than Bernardo Accolti, known as the Unico Aretino. A poet of considerable reputation, Accolti was famous for his ability to improvise verse before vast audiences. In the dialogues, he poses as the sentimental lover, the man who has been cruelly wronged by women, the victim of ingratitude and coldness. But the other interlocutors see through him. Emilia Pia, the sharp-witted friend of the Duchess, accuses him of feigning love to hide the favors he has actually received. She suggests that his laments are a performance designed to reassure the women who love him that he will not betray them. The Unico is exposed as someone who tries too hard to appear lovable. His self-presentation as the wounded romantic is so elaborate, so carefully crafted, that it becomes transparent. He is the man who cannot stop talking about his own suffering, who makes every conversation about himself, who mistakes self-dramatization for charm. The court of Urbino, like all elite circles, had a finely tuned detector for this kind of performance, and the Unico, for all his poetic gifts, could not pass the test. Castiglione's point is subtle. The Unico is not a fool. He is genuinely talented, genuinely admired, genuinely successful. But he lacks the final degree of self-awareness that would allow him to see himself as others see him. He believes his own performance, and that belief, which makes him so convincing to the crowds who come to hear his verses, makes him ridiculous in the intimate setting of the court. He is the man who cannot stop playing to the gallery, even when the gallery has been replaced by a circle of 10 people who have known him for years. Wit as social gatekeeping. The court of Urbino was not alone in using wit as a filter. Across European elite society, the ability to speak amusingly without losing dignity became a marker of belonging. Those who could not manage this balance were excluded, not through formal decree but through the quiet withdrawal of invitations, the cooling of friendships, the gradual realization that they were not quite welcome. The salon culture of 18th century Paris refined this mechanism to an art form. Hostesses like Madame Geffrin and Madame du Deffand presided over gatherings where wit was the only currency that mattered. A single clumsy remark could end a career. A well-timed epigram could make a reputation. The salon was a court in miniature, with its own hierarchies, its own favorites, its own outcasts. And the rules were Castiglione's rules. No pedantry, no boasting, no tedious length, no cruelty without purpose, no desperation. Consider the case of Voltaire, who understood these rules better than almost anyone. He was the most famous wit in Europe, yet he knew exactly when to deploy his sharpness and when to hold back. He flattered where flattery was required, charmed where charm was needed, and reserved his most devastating epigrams for those who had already forfeited the protection of the powerful. When he was exiled from France, he took refuge at the court of Frederick the Great, where his wit was both his passport and his peril. In the end, even Voltaire went too far, and the friendship with Frederick collapsed into mutual contempt. The English tradition produced its own exemplars. The Whig hostesses of the 18th century, women like Lady Mary Wortley Montagu and Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, used conversation as a political instrument. A clever remark dropped at dinner could shape policy. A humorous story told in the right ear could destroy a rival. Wit was not decoration. It was ammunition. The danger of going too far. Castiglione warns repeatedly against excess. The courtier who tries too hard to be amusing, who reaches for laughter at every turn, who cannot bear a moment of silence, reveals his insecurity. He is not confident that his presence alone is enough. He must perform. And performance, once detected, is fatal. Bibbiena illustrates this with a story about two cardinals who criticized a painting by Raphael. The painting depicted Saint Peter and Saint Paul, and the cardinals complained that the faces were too red. Raphael replied, without missing a beat, that he had painted them that way intentionally, because Saint Peter and Saint Paul must be red with shame at seeing their church governed by such men as the cardinals. The retort was devastating, but it was also dangerous. Raphael could afford it only because he was protected by his genius and by powerful patrons. A lesser man who spoke so boldly would have been destroyed. The lesson is that wit must be calibrated to one's standing. A cardinal can joke in ways that a minor courtier cannot. A prince can say things that would ruin anyone else. The courtier who forgets his place, who reaches for a witticism that exceeds his rank, who assumes a familiarity that has not been granted, commits an error that no amount of cleverness can repair. This is why Castiglione insists on modesty as the companion of wit. The courtier who is modest does not need to prove himself. He is not constantly testing the boundaries, seeking approval, fishing for laughter. He speaks when he has something to say, stays silent when he does not, and trusts that his worth will be recognized without constant demonstration. This quiet confidence is itself a form of power. It signals that the courtier belongs, that he is not anxious, that he has nothing to prove. The political uses of charm. The highest purpose of wit, in Castiglione's system, is not entertainment. It is governance at close range. The courtier who has won his prince's favor through charm and grace can then use that favor to guide the prince toward virtue. He can tell the truth without giving offense. He can correct errors without provoking anger. He can make the path of righteousness seem attractive, even delightful. This is the argument of Ottaviano Fregoso in Book 4. The courtier's accomplishments, including his wit and his conversational skill, are not ends in themselves. They are means to a higher end, the instruction of the prince. The courtier who can make his prince laugh can also make him think. The courtier who can entertain can also educate. The courtier who has earned the right to speak freely can shape the destiny of kingdoms. But this power depends entirely on the preservation of charm. The moment the courtier becomes tedious, or offensive, or desperate, he loses his access. The prince will no longer listen. The door will close, and all the wit in the world will not reopen it. This is why Castiglione returns again and again to the theme of judgment. The courtier must know not only how to be witty, but when to stop. He must sense the limits of his listener's patience. He must recognize when a joke has landed and when it has misfired. He must be able to laugh at himself, to retreat gracefully, to turn failure into self-deprecating humor that endears rather than embarrasses. The silence that speaks. Perhaps the most important lesson of the courtier is one that Castiglione never states directly. It is that silence, well managed, is more powerful than speech. The courtier who talks constantly, who fills every silence with words, who cannot bear the weight of an unfilled pause, reveals his anxiety. He is afraid of what silence might say about him. He is afraid that without his voice, he will disappear. The courtier who can sit quietly, who can listen, who can let others speak and still command attention, has reached a higher level of mastery. His silence is not emptiness, it is presence. It says that he does not need to perform because his worth is already established. It says that he is comfortable in his own skin, that he has nothing to prove, that he can afford to let others take the spotlight. This is the final stage of courtly grace. The beginner speaks too much, trying to impress. The intermediate speaks well, charming and engaging. The master speaks only when necessary, and when he speaks, everyone listens. The rest of the time, he is silent, and his silence is more eloquent than most men's speech. The legacy of Castiglione's wit. The conversational code that Castiglione codified at Urbino did not die with the Renaissance. It migrated across Europe, adapting to different courts, different centuries, different social forms. It shaped the drawing rooms of London, the salons of Paris, the diplomatic receptions of Vienna. It informed the way aristocrats spoke to one another, the way they judged one another, the way they included and excluded. It became, in the hands of the old money families who survived revolutions and wars, a private language, a set of signals that only the initiated could read. Those who lacked the code were not necessarily unintelligent or uninteresting. They simply did not belong. They spoke too loudly or too softly. They laughed at the wrong moments. They told jokes that were too long or too personal or too coarse. They tried too hard, and their trying was visible. And because it was visible, it was fatal. Castiglione's great insight is that wit in elite society is never just about being funny. It is about power. It is about who can make whom laugh, and who laughs at whose jokes, and who is allowed to tease and who must only listen. It is about the 1,000 small judgments that happen in every conversation, judgments that determine who rises and who falls, who is remembered and who is forgotten. The courtier who masters this art does not merely survive, he thrives. He becomes indispensable. He speaks truth to power without losing his head. He entertains without degrading himself. He uses charm as a weapon and a shield. And when he finally falls silent, his silence is remembered longer than most men's speeches. In the end, the voice that reveals rank is not the voice that shouts the loudest. It is the voice that knows when to speak, what to say, and when to stop. It is the voice that has learned, through long discipline, to make the difficult look easy, the calculated look natural, the strategic look sincere. It is the voice of the courtier who has become, at last, what Castiglione wanted him to become. A man whose every word is a gift, and whose silence is a command.